The morning after discharge felt quieter than expected. Soft sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of the provincial hospital room, casting a gentle glow on Tieu Lac's pale face. The swelling around her ankle had reduced, but a dull ache still lingered with every small movement. She sat up slowly on the narrow bed, her gaze drifting toward the window, where a few lonely bamboo stalks swayed in the breeze outside. Quan stood leaning against the doorframe, holding the discharge papers in one hand. His white shirt was slightly wrinkled from the long night, yet his tall frame still carried that quiet authority she had grown used to. Only now the usual sharpness in his eyes had softened into something warmer, something protective and patient. "Ready to go home?" His voice was low and steady. Tieu Lac nodded, her voice soft. "Yes, I don't want to stay here any longer." Quan didn't argue. He stepped closer, sliding one arm around her waist to support her as she stood. The closeness made her acutely aware of his presence, the clean scent of soap mixed with faint woodsy notes, the solid warmth of his body. She instinctively rested a hand on his arm for balance. The drive back to the bamboo house was unhurried. Quan kept the speed slow along the winding red dirt road that cut through rice fields and thick bamboo groves. Tieu Lac sat in the passenger seat with her injured legs stretched out, occasionally glancing at him. He drove with one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally adjusting the air conditioning or asking quietly if she was comfortable. When the car finally stopped in front of the familiar wooden porch, Tieu Lac let out a soft breath of relief. The gourd trellis behind the house was still lush and heavy, with long, pale green fruits hanging like silent guardians. Everything looked exactly as she had left it, yet she knew nothing was quite the same, not with him here. Quan turned off the engine and looked at her. "From today onward, you're not allowed to do any heavy work. You can only sit and give me orders." A small smile touched her lips. "Do you even know how to tie a gourd trellis?" "I'll learn," he replied simply. He got out first, then came around to her side. Without asking, he scooped her up into his arms, one arm under her knees, the other supporting her back. Tieu Lac's arms naturally looped around his neck. "Quan, I can walk," she protested weakly. "Your leg is still weak," he said, tone firm but gentle. "Let me." She didn't argue further. His steps were steady across the damp ground as he carried her into the house and carefully set her down on the old wooden sofa. For a brief moment, her fingers lingered on his sleeve before she let go. Their eyes met. Neither spoke, but the air between them felt heavier with unspoken understanding. Throughout the morning, Quan refused to let her lift a finger. He swept the porch, brought in fresh water, and then headed out to the garden. From her seat on the porch, Tieu Lac watched him. His tall figure moved with surprising care as he watered the gourd vines and tried to retie the loose strings that had come undone in last night's wind. Something warm bloomed quietly in her chest. She had grown so used to doing everything alone. Seeing someone else tend to her small world felt both strange and deeply comforting. Near noon, Quan disappeared into the kitchen. The rhythmic sound of chopping echoed softly. Following her instructions from the hospital, he prepared a simple chicken porridge. When he brought the steaming bowl out, he sat beside her and blew gently on each spoonful before offering it. "It's lightly seasoned. I wasn't sure about your taste." Their fingers brushed as she took the spoon. Both paused for a fraction of a second. Tieu Lac lowered her gaze and ate slowly, hiding the faint flush creeping up her cheeks. By afternoon, the sky had begun to change. Gray clouds rolled in from the mountains, carrying the scent of damp earth and wet bamboo. The air turned cool and fresh. Quan glanced upward, then back at her. "It's going to rain. Do you want to stay inside or sit out here?" "Out here," she answered softly. "I like listening to the rain on the tiled roof." He nodded without protest. He fetched a thin blanket and draped it carefully over her legs, then sat down beside her on the long wooden bench. The bench was just wide enough for two, yet he maintained a respectful distance, close enough for her to feel his warmth, far enough to give her space. The rain started lightly, then grew steadier. Droplets pattered rhythmically on the moss-covered roof tiles, creating a soothing, steady melody. Water streamed down the eaves in clear, thin curtains. The world outside blurred into soft greens and earthy browns. The scent of wet soil, bamboo leaves, and rain-soaked gourds filled the air. Tieu Lac leaned her head gently against Quan's shoulder. He didn't pull away. Instead, his hand rested lightly on the edge of the bench near hers. "I used to be afraid of the rain," she murmured, her voice blending with the sound of falling water. "Back in the city, heavy rain made the small apartment feel like it was closing in. It reminded me how alone I was. That's why I came here, to the bamboo forest. At least here, I could control my own loneliness." Quan listened in silence, his gaze fixed on the garden, where raindrops glistened on the broad gourd leaves. After a long pause, he spoke, his deep voice quiet. "I was afraid too. Not of rain, but of losing control. In the city, I controlled everything. My company, my schedules, even my emotions. There was a woman once who made me believe love could be planned like a business deal, but she left because I was too busy, too cold. After that, I built walls. I didn't let anyone close because I didn't want to be hurt again." Tieu Lac lifted her head to look at him. The rain continued falling, but now it felt like background music to the quiet unraveling of their guarded hearts. "And yet, you're here," she whispered, "with me, a girl who only knows how to grow gourds and harvest bamboo shoots." Quan turned to face her. Their faces were only inches apart. His dark eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Yes, I'm here, not out of duty, not out of pity." His voice dropped lower. "Every time I watch you tend to these vines, every time you smile at a perfectly grown gourd, I realize I want to stay longer. I want to learn how to let go of control. I want to be with you." The rain grew heavier, drumming steadily on the roof. Tieu Lac's heart beat faster. She didn't know what to say. All she knew was that his shoulder felt warm and steady, and for the first time in years, the loneliness she had carried for so long seemed to dissolve in his quiet presence. When the rain finally began to ease, faint rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, bathing the garden in a soft golden light. The gourd leaves shimmered with clinging raindrops, and the air smelled impossibly fresh. Quan stood first. He bent down and lifted her effortlessly into his arms again. "Come, let me take you to see the garden after the rain." Tieu Lac didn't protest. She wrapped her arms around his neck as he carried her out into the damp garden. The ground was soft under his feet. He stopped in front of the gourd trellis and set her down gently, keeping his arms around her waist so she wouldn't lose balance. Golden afternoon light slanted across the long, pale green gourds. Tieu Lac reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against one smooth fruit. Quan lowered his head. His lips brushed lightly against her hair in the softest kiss, tender, unhurried, full of quiet emotion. "From now on, I don't want you to face anything alone," he murmured, voice husky with feeling. "Will you let me stay by your side, Tieu Lac?" She remained silent for a long moment, emotions swirling inside her. Then she gave a small nod and tightened her grip on his hand. No grand declarations, just a simple, heartfelt moment. Two people standing together in a rain-fresh garden, hearts quietly drawing closer. Yet deep down, both knew this peaceful interlude was fragile. The mysterious phone calls and shadowy figures lurking beyond the bamboo grove had not disappeared. For now, however, they chose to linger in this gentle, healing moment. That evening, the bamboo grove seemed to hold its breath. The air after the rain was crisp and cool, carrying the earthy scent of wet soil and fresh leaves. Golden sunset light filtered through the tall stalks, painting long shadows across the wooden house and the gourd trellis. Tieu Lac sat on the porch steps, her injured leg propped on a low stool Quan had brought out for her. A light blanket covered her lap, and in her hands was a warm cup of ginger tea he had brewed. Quan moved quietly around the small yard, gathering fallen branches and checking the trellis one last time. His white shirt sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, revealing the toned muscles of his forearms. Even in these simple farm clothes, he still carried an undeniable presence. The quiet strength of a man who once commanded boardrooms, but now chose to kneel in the mud to fix a loose vine for her. Tieu Lac watched him without speaking. The memory of his soft kiss on her hair earlier lingered like a warm touch on her skin. She had nodded to his question, but words still felt too heavy, too soon. Instead, she let the silence between them speak, comfortable, full of unspoken promises. When Quan finished, he wiped his hands on a cloth and walked back to the porch. He didn't sit immediately. He stood there for a moment, looking down at her with those dark, intense eyes that always seemed to see more than she wanted to show. "Hungry?" he asked softly. She nodded. "A little." He disappeared inside and returned shortly with 2 simple bowls: steamed rice, stir-fried vegetables from the garden, and a small portion of tender bamboo shoots he had harvested earlier. He placed everything on the low wooden table he had pulled closer to the steps. Then, instead of sitting across from her, he chose the spot right beside her on the wide step. They ate in companionable silence at first. The only sounds were the distant rustle of bamboo leaves and the occasional call of evening birds returning to their nests. Tieu Lac ate slowly, savoring each bite. Everything tasted better when prepared by his hands. After a while, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for today, for everything." Quan set his chopsticks down and turned to look at her. The fading sunlight caught the side of his face, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw and the faint exhaustion in his eyes. "You don't have to thank me, Tieu Lac. I wanted to be here." She lowered her gaze to the bowl in her lap. "It's strange. I've lived here alone for so long. I thought I was fine with the quiet, but having you here, it makes the house feel warmer, less empty." Quan was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his tone was low and sincere. "For me too. In the city, my house is large, modern, full of expensive things. But it's always felt cold, empty. Being here with you, in this small wooden house surrounded by bamboo and gourds, it feels real, like I can finally breathe." Their eyes met again. The distance between them on the step felt smaller now. Tieu Lac could see the subtle rise and fall of his chest, the way his fingers rested loosely on his knee, close enough that she could reach out if she wanted. As night fell, Quan helped her back inside. He lit a few oil lamps, casting a soft golden glow throughout the simple living space. The wooden walls seemed to come alive with flickering shadows. He insisted on checking her bandage, his touch careful and professional, as he reapplied the ointment the doctor had given them. While he worked, Tieu Lac studied his face, the concentrated frown, the gentle way his fingers moved over her skin. Something deep inside her chest tightened, not from pain, but from a growing warmth she could no longer ignore. "Quan," she said quietly when he finished. He looked up, still kneeling beside the couch. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "Not just of the snake or the phone calls. I'm scared that one day you'll have to go back to your world, the city, the company, the life you built, and I'll be here again, alone with my gourds and my silence." Quan's expression softened. He rose slowly and sat on the edge of the couch, close enough that their knees almost touched. He took her hand in both of his thumbs tracing slow, soothing circles on the back of her palm, the same gesture he had used in the hospital. "I won't lie to you," he said, voice steady but laced with emotion. "My world is complicated. There are responsibilities waiting for me. But right now, none of that matters more than this. More than you." He paused, searching her eyes. "I've spent years building walls so no one could hurt me. But you slipped through them without even trying. Every time you smile at those gourds, Every time you talk about the forest like it's your oldest friend, I feel myself changing. I don't want to go back to being the man who only knew how to control everything. I want to learn how to stay, how to be here with you." Tears welled up in Tieu Lac's eyes. She didn't try to hide them. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel vulnerable in front of someone else. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she whispered, "but I don't want you to leave either." Quan lifted her hand and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried the weight of everything he couldn't yet say in full. "Then we take it one day at a time," he murmured. "No pressure, no rush, just us. Here, in this house, with the bamboo and the gourds." Later that night, when the house grew quiet and the oil lamps were dimmed, Quan made sure she was comfortable in bed before settling himself on the wooden couch nearby. He had refused her offer to let him take the bed, insisting she needed proper rest for her leg. Tieu Lac lay awake for a while, listening to the soft rustling of the bamboo outside. Moonlight streamed through the small window, casting silvery patterns on the wooden floor. She turned her head slightly and saw Quan's silhouette in the dim light. He wasn't sleeping either. His eyes were open, watching over her with quiet vigilance. "Quan," she called softly. Are you really okay sleeping there?" A low chuckle escaped him. "I've slept in worse places during business trips. This is nothing." She smiled into the darkness. "Thank you for staying." "Always," he replied, his voice warm and certain. Sleep finally claimed her, peaceful and deep for the first time since the snake bite. Quan stayed awake longer, his gaze never leaving her sleeping form. The strong, controlled CEO, who once feared nothing, now found his greatest fear was losing the quiet peace he had found in this small bamboo house, and in the woman who had slowly begun to heal his guarded heart. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Birds sang loudly among the bamboo stalks. Quan woke early and prepared a simple breakfast, congee with fresh herbs from the garden. When Tieu Lac limped out to the porch with his help, she found him already working gently on the gourd trellis again, this time with more confidence. He looked up when he heard her, a small but genuine smile curving his lips. The sunlight caught in his dark hair, making him look younger, more relaxed than she had ever seen him in the city. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she replied, her heart feeling lighter. They spent the day together in quiet harmony. Quan helped her move around the garden, supporting her whenever her ankle ached. They harvested a few ripe gourds together, their hands occasionally brushing as they worked side by side. Each small touch sent a quiet spark through both of them, a reminder of the growing bond neither wanted to name yet. In the late afternoon, as they sat together under the shade of the bamboo, Tieu Lac leaned her head against his shoulder once more. Quan wrapped an arm around her, pulling her closer this time. No words were needed. The gentle breeze rustled the leaves above them, and the distant sound of the forest created a perfect backdrop. For now, the world beyond the bamboo grove, with its mysterious calls and hidden dangers, felt far away. In this moment, there was only the two of them, the wooden house, the gourd trellis, and the slow, beautiful healing of two wounded hearts finding solace in each other. But even in this peaceful interlude, a faint shadow lingered at the edge of their awareness. Deep in the forest, unseen eyes might still be watching. Yet for today, Quan and Tieu Lac chose to hold on to the warmth they had found. One careful step, one gentle touch, one shared sunrise at a time.